Not even a fortnight passed before I stood in the midst of the noonday crowds in the vast public cemetery of Les Innocents, with its old vaults and stinking open graves, the most fantastical marketplace I had ever beheld, and, amid the stench and the noise, bent over an Italian letter writer dictating my first letter to my mother. Yes, we had arrived safely after traveling day and night, and we had rooms in the Ile de la Cité. And we were inexpressibly happy. And Paris was warm and beautiful and magnificent beyond all imagining. I wished I could have taken the pen myself and written to her. I wished I could have told her what it was like, seeing these towering mansions, ancient winding streets aswarm with beggars, peddlers, noblemen, houses of 4 and 5 stories banking, the crowded boulevards. I wished I could have described the carriages to her, the rumbling confections of gilt and glass bullying their way over the Pont Neuf and the Pont Notre-Dame, streaming past the Louvre, the Palais Royal. I wished I could describe the people, the gentlemen with their clocked stockings and silver walking sticks tripping through the mud in pastel slippers, the ladies with their pearl-encrusted wigs and swaying panier of silk and muslin, my first certain glimpse of Queen Marie Antoinette herself, walking boldly through the gardens of the Tuileries. Of course, she'd seen it all years and years before I was born. She lived in Naples and London and Rome with her father, but I wanted to tell her what she had given to me, how it was to hear the choir in Notre-Dame, to push into the jam-packed café with Nicolas, talk with his old student cronies over English coffee, what it was like to get dressed up in Nicolas's fine clothes. He made me do it, and stand below the footlights at the Comédie Française, gazing up in adoration at the actors on the stage. But all I wrote in this letter was perhaps the very best of it, the address of the garret rooms. We called our home in the Ile de la Cité, and the news I have been hired in a real theatre to study as an actor, with a fine prospect of performing very soon. What I didn't tell her was that we had to walk up 6 flights of stairs to our rooms, that men and women brawled and screamed in the alleyways beneath our windows, that we had run out of money already, thanks to my dragging us to every opera, ballet, and drama in town, and that the establishment where I worked was a shabby little boulevard theatre, one step up from a platform at the fair, and my jobs were to help the players dress, sell tickets, sweep up, and throw out the troublemakers. But I was in paradise again, and so was Nicholas, though no decent orchestra in the city would hire him, and he was now playing solos with a little bunch of musicians in the theatre where I worked, and when we were really pinched, he did play right on the boulevard with me beside him, holding out the hat. We were shameless. We ran up the steps each night with our bottle of cheap wine and a loaf of fine, sweet Parisian bread, which was ambrosia after what we'd eaten in the Auvergne, and in the light of our one tallow candle. The garret was the most glorious place I'd ever inhabited. As I mentioned before, I'd seldom been in a little wooden Rome, except in the inn. Well, this room had plaster walls and a plaster ceiling. It was really Paris. It had polished wood flooring and even a tiny little fireplace with a new chimney which actually made a draft. So what if we had to sleep on lumpy pallets and the neighbors woke us up fighting? We were waking up in Paris and could roam arm in arm for hours through streets and alleyways, peering into shops full of jewelry and plate, tapestries and statues, wealth such as I'd never seen. Even the reeking meat markets delighted me. The crash and clatter of the city, the tireless busyness of its thousands upon thousands of laborers, clerks, craftsmen, the comings and goings of an endless multitude. By day, I almost forgot the vision of the inn and the darkness, unless, of course, I glimpsed some uncollected corpse in a filthy alleyway, of which there were many, or I happened upon a public execution in the Place de Grève. And I was always happening upon a public execution in the Place de Grève. I'd wander out of the square shuddering, almost moaning. I could become obsessed with it, if not distracted. But Nicholas was adamant. Lestat, no talk of the eternal, the immutable, the unknowable. He threatened to hit me or shake me if I should start. And when twilight came on, the time I hated more than ever, whether I had seen an execution or not, whether the day had been glorious or vexing, the trembling would start in me. And only one thing saved me from it, the warmth and excitement of the brightly lighted theater, and I made sure that before dusk I was safely inside. Now, in the Paris of those times, the theaters of the boulevards weren't even legitimate houses at all. Only the Comédie Française and the Théâtre des Italiens were government-sanctioned theaters, and to them, all serious drama belonged. This included tragedy as well as comedy, the plays off Racine, Corneille, the brilliant Voltaire, but the old Italian commedia that I loved, Pantaloon, Harlequin, Scaramucci, and the rest lived on as they always had, with tightrope walkers, acrobats, jugglers and puppeteers in the platform spectacles at the Saint-Germain and the Saint-Laurent fairs. And boulevard theaters had grown out of these fairs. By my time, the last decades of the 18th century, they were permanent establishments along the Boulevard du Temple, and though they played to the poor who couldn't afford the grand houses, they also collected a very well-to-do crowd. Plenty of the aristocracy and the rich bourgeoisie crowded into the loges to see the boulevard performances because they were lively and full of good talent, and not so stiff as the plays of the great Racine or the great Voltaire. We did the Italian comedy just as I'd learned it before, full of improvisation, so that every night it was new and different, yet always the same. And we also did singing and all kinds of nonsense, not just because the people loved it, but because we had to. We couldn't be accused of breaking the monopoly of the state theaters on stray plays. The house itself was a rickety wooden rat trap, seating no more than 300, but its little stage and props were elegant. It had a luxurious blue velvet stage curtain, and its private boxes had screens, and its actors and actresses were seasoned and truly talented, or so it seemed to me, even if I hadn't had this newly acquired dread of the dark, this maladie of mortality, as Nicholas persisted in calling it. It couldn't have been more exciting to go through that stage door. 4, 5 to 6 hours every evening I lived and breathed in a little universe of shouting and laughing and quarreling, men and women, struggling for this one and against that one, 8 of us comrades in the wings, even if we weren't friends. Maybe it was like being in a little boat on the ocean, all of us pulling together, unable to escape each other. It was divine. Nicholas was slightly less enthusiastic, but then that was to be expected. And he got even more ironical when his rich student friends came around to talk to him. They thought he was a lunatic to live as he did. And for me, a nobleman shoveling actresses into their costumes and emptying slop buckets, they had not words at all. Of course, all that these young bourgeois really wanted was to be aristocrats. They bought titles, married into aristocratic families whenever they could, and it's one of the little jokes of history that they got mixed up in the revolution and helped to abolish the class which in fact they really wanted to join. I didn't care if we ever saw Nicholas's friends again. The actors didn't know about my family. And in favor of the very simple Lestat de Valois, which meant nothing actually, I dropped my real name, de Lioncourt. I was learning everything I could about the stage. I memorized, I mimicked. I asked endless questions, and only stopped my education long enough each night for that moment when Nicholas played his solo on the violin. He'd rise from his seat in the tiny orchestra. The spotlight would pick him out from the others, and he would rip into a little sonata, sweet enough and just short enough to bring down the house. And all the while I dreamed of my own moment when the old actors, whom I studied and pestered and imitated and waited upon like a lackey, would finally say, "All right, Lestat, tonight we need you as Lelio. Now you ought to know what to do." It came in late August at last. Paris was at its warmest, and the nights were almost balmy, and the house was full of a restless audience, canning itself with handkerchiefs and handbills. The thick white paint was melting on my face as I put it on. I wore a pasteboard sword with Nicholas's best velvet coat, and I was trembling before I stepped on the stage thinking, this is like waiting to be executed or something. But as soon as I stepped out there, I turned and looked directly into the jam-packed hall, and the strangest thing happened. The fear evaporated. I beamed at the audience and very slowly I bowed. I stared at the lovely Flaminia as if I were seeing her for the first time. I had to win her. The romp began. The stage belonged to me as it had years and years ago in that far-off country town. And as we pranced madly together across the boards, quarreling, embracing, clowning, laughter rocked the house. I could feel the attention as if it were an embrace. Each gesture, each line brought a roar from the audience. It was too easy almost, and we could have worked it for another half hour if the other actors, eager to get into the next trick as they called it, hadn't forced us, finally towards the wings. The crowd was standing up to applaud us, and it wasn't that country audience under the open sky. These were Parisians shouting for Lelio and Flaminia to come back out. In the shadows off the wings I reeled. I almost collapsed. I could not see anything for the moment but the vision of the audience gazing up at me over the footlights. I wanted to go right back on stage. I grabbed Flaminia and kissed her and realized that she was kissing me back passionately. Then Renaud, the old manager, pulled her away. "All right, Lestat," he said as if he were cross about something. "All right, you've done tolerably well. I'm going to let you go on regularly from now on." But before I could start jumping up and down for joy, half the troupe materialized around us. And Lucina, one of the actresses, immediately spoke up. "Oh no, you'll not let him go on regularly," she said. "He's the handsomest actor on the Boulevard du Temple, and you'll hire him outright for it, and pay him outright for it, and he doesn't touch another broom or mop." I was terrified. My career had just started, and it was about to be over, but to my amazement Renaud agreed to all her terms. Of course, I was very flattered to be called handsome, and I understood as I had years ago that Lelio, the lover, is supposed to have considerable style. An aristocrat with any breeding whatsoever was perfect for the part. But if I was going to make the Paris audiences really notice me, if I was going to have them talking about me at the Comédie Française, I had to be more than some yellow-haired angel fallen out of a marquise's family onto the stage. I had to be a great actor, and that is exactly what I determined to be. That night, Nicholas and I celebrated with a colossal drunk. We had all the troupe up to our rooms for it, and I climbed out on the slippery rooftops and opened my arms to Paris. And Nicholas played his violin in the window until we'd awaken the whole neighborhood. The music was rapturous, yet people were snarling and screaming up the alleyways and banging on pots and pans. We paid no attention. We were dancing and singing as we had in the witch's place. I almost fell off the window ledge. The next day, bottle in hand, I dictated the whole story to the Italian letter writer in the stinking sunshine in Les Innocents, and saw that the letter went off to my mother at once. I wanted to embrace everybody I saw on the streets. I was Lelio. I was an actor. By September, I had my name on the handbills, and I sent those to my mother too. And we weren't doing the old commedia. We were performing a farce by a famous writer who, on account of a general playwright strike, couldn't get it performed at the Comédie Française. Of course, we couldn't say his name, but everyone knew it was his work, and half the court was packing Renaud's house of thespians every night. I wasn't the lead, but I was the young lover, a sort of Lelio again, really, which was almost better than the lead, and I stole every scene in which I appeared. Nicholas had taught me the part, bawling me out constantly for not learning to read, and by the fourth performance the playwright had written extra lines for me. Nicky was having his own moment at the intermezzo, when his latest renderings of a frothy little Mozart sonata was keeping the house in its seats. Even his student friends were back. We were getting invitations to private balls. I went tearing off to Les Innocents every few days to write to my mother. And finally I had a clipping from an English paper, The Spectator, to send her, which praised our little play, and in particular the blonde-haired rogue who steals the hearts of the ladies in the third and fourth acts. Of course, I couldn't read this clipping, but the gentleman who'd brought it to me said it was complimentary, and Nicholas swore it was too. When the first chill nights of fall came on, I wore the fur-lined red cloak on the stage. You could have seen it in the back row of the gallery, even if you were almost blind. I had more skill now with the white makeup, shading it here and there, to heighten the contours of my face. And though my eyes were ringed in black and my lips reddened a little, I looked both startling and human at the same time. I got love notes from the women in the crowd. Nicholas was studying music in the mornings with an Italian maestro. Yet we had money enough for good food, wood, and coal. My mother's letters came twice a week and said her health had taken a turn for the better. She wasn't coughing as badly as last winter. She wasn't in pain. But our father had disowned us and would not acknowledge any mention of our names. We were too happy to worry about that. But the dark dread, the maladie of mortality, was with me a lot when the cold weather came on. The cold seemed worse in Paris. It wasn't clean as it had been in the mountains. The poor hovered in doorways, shivering and hungry. The crooked, unpaved streets were thick with filthy slush. I saw barefoot children suffering before my very eyes, and more neglected corpses lying about than ever before. I was never so glad of the fur-lined cape as I was then. I wrapped it around Nicholas and held him close to me when we went out together, and we walked in a tight embrace through the snow and the rain. Cold or no cold, I can't exaggerate the happiness of these days. Life was exactly what I thought it could be, and I knew I wouldn't be long in Renault's theater. Everybody was saying so. I had visions of the big stages, of touring London and Italy, and even America, with a great troupe of actors. Yet there was no reason to hurry. My cup was full. But in the month of October, when Paris was already freezing, I commenced to see, quite regularly, a strange face in the audience that invariably distracted me. Sometimes it almost made me forget what I was doing, this face, and then it would be gone as if I'd imagined it. I must have seen it off and on for a fortnight before I finally mentioned it to Nicky. I felt foolish and found it hard to put into words. "There is someone out there watching me," I said. "Everyone's watching you," Nicky said. "That's what you want." He was feeling a little sad that evening, and his answer was slightly sharp. Earlier, when he was making the fire, he had said he would never amount to much with a violin. In spite of his ear and his skill, there was too much he didn't know, and I would be a great actor, he was sure. I had said this was nonsense, but it was a shadow falling over my soul. I remembered my mother telling me that it was too late for him. He wasn't envious, he said. He was just unhappy a little, that's all. I decided to drop the matter of the mysterious face. I tried to think of some way to encourage him. I reminded him that his playing produced profound emotions in people, that even the actors backstage stopped to listen when he played. He had an undeniable talent. "But I want to be a great violinist," he said, "and I'm afraid it will never be. As long as we were at home, I could pretend that it was going to be." "You can't give up on it," I said. "Lestat, let me be frank with you," he said. "Things are easy for you. What you set your sights on, you get for yourself. I know what you're thinking about all the years you were miserable at home, but even then, what you really set your mind to, you accomplished. And we left for Paris the very day that you decided to do it." "You don't regret coming to Paris, do you?" I asked. "Of course not. I simply mean that you think things are possible which aren't possible. At least not for the rest of us. Like killing the wolves." A coldness passed over me when he said this, and for some reason I thought of that mysterious face again in the audience, the one watching. Something to do with the wolves, something to do with the sentiments Nicky was expressing. Didn't make sense. I tried to shrug it off. "If you'd set out to play the violin, you'd probably be playing for the court by now." "Nicky, this kind of talk is poison," I said under my breath. "You can't do anything but try to get what you want. You knew the odds were against you when you started. There isn't anything else except," "I know," he smiled, "except the meaninglessness, death." "Yes," I said, "all you can do is make your life have meaning, make it good." "Oh, not goodness again," he said, "you and your maladie of mortality and your maladie of goodness." He had been looking at the fire, and he turned to me with a deliberately scornful expression. "We're a pack of actors and entertainers who can't even be buried in consecrated ground. We're outcasts. God, if you could only believe in it," I said, "that we do good when we make others forget their sorrow. Make them forget for a little while that," "What? That they are going to die?" He smiled in a particularly vicious way. "Lestat, I thought all this would change with you when we got to Paris." "That was foolish of you, Nick," I answered. He was making me angry now. "I do good in the Boulevard du Temple. I feel it." I stopped because I saw the mysterious face again, and a dark feeling had passed over me, something of foreboding. Yet even that startling face was unusually smiling. That was the odd thing. Yes, smiling, enjoying. Lestat, I love you, Nicky said gravely. I love you as I have loved few people in my life. But in a real way, you're a fool with all your ideas about goodness. I laughed. Nicholas, I said, I can live without God. I can even come to live with the idea there is no life after. But I do not think I could go on if I did not believe in the possibility of goodness. Instead of mocking me for once, why don't you tell me what you believe? As I see it, he said, there's weakness and there's strength, and there is good art and bad art. And that is what I believe in. At the moment we are engaged in making what is rather bad art, and it has nothing to do with goodness. Our conversation could have fumed into a full-scale fight here if I had said all that was on my mind about bourgeois pomposity, for I fully believed that our work at Renault's was in many ways finer than what I saw at the grand theatres. Only the framework was less impressive. Why couldn't a bourgeois gentleman forget about the frame? How could he be made to look at something other than the surface? I took a deep breath. If goodness does exist, he said, then I'm the opposite of it. I'm evil, and I revel in it. I thumb my nose at goodness. And if you must know, I don't play the violin for the idiots who come to Renault's to make them happy. I play it for me, for Nicholas. I didn't want to hear any more. It was time to go to bed. But I was bruised by this little talk, and he knew it, and as I started to pull off my boots, he got up from the chair and came and sat next to me. I'm sorry, he said in the most broken voice. It was so changed from the posture of a minute ago that I looked up at him, and he was so young and so miserable that I couldn't help putting my arm around him and telling him that he must not worry about it any more. You have a radiance in you, Lestat, he said, and it draws everyone to you. It's there even when you're angry or discouraged. Poetry, I said. We're both tired. No, it's true, he said. You have a light in you that's almost blinding, but in me there's only darkness. Sometimes I think it's like the darkness that infected you that night in the inn when you began to cry and to tremble. You were so helpless, so unprepared for it. I tried to keep the darkness from you because I need your light. I need it desperately. But you don't need the darkness. You're the mad one, I said. If you could see yourself, hear your own voice, your music, which of course you play for yourself, you wouldn't see darkness, Nicky. You'd see an illumination that is all your own. Somber, yes, but light and beauty come together in you in 1,000 different patterns. The next night, the performance went especially well. The audience was a lively one, inspiring all of us to extra tricks. I did some new dance steps that for some reason never proved interesting in private rehearsal, but worked miraculously on the stage. And Nicky was extraordinary with the violin, playing one of his own compositions. But towards the end of the evening, I glimpsed the mysterious face again. It jarred me worse than it ever had, and I almost lost the rhythm of my song. In fact, it seemed my head for a moment was swimming. When Nicky and I were alone, I had to talk about it, about the peculiar sensation that I had fallen asleep on the stage and had been dreaming. We sat by the hearth together with our wine on the top of a little barrel, and in the firelight Nicky looked as weary and dejected as he had the night before. I didn't want to trouble him, but I couldn't forget about the face. Well, what does he look like? Nicholas asked. He was warming his hands, and over his shoulder I saw through the window a city of snow-covered rooftops that made me feel more cold. I didn't like this conversation. That's the worst part of it, I said. All I see is a face. He must be wearing something black, a cloak, and even a hood, but it looks like a mask to me, the face. Very white and strangely clear. I mean, the lines in his face are so deep. They seem to be etched with black grease paint. I see it for a moment, it veritably glows. Then when I look again, there's no one there. Yet this is an exaggeration. It's more subtle than that, the way he looks, and yet the description seemed to disturb Nicky as much as it disturbed me. He didn't say anything, but his face softened somewhat as if he were forgetting his sadness. Well, I don't want to get your hopes up, he said. He was very kind and sincere now. But maybe it is a mask you're seeing, and maybe it's someone from the Comédie Française come to see you perform. I shook my head. I wish it was, but no one would wear a mask like that, and I'll tell you something else too. He waited, but I could see I was passing on to him some of my own apprehension. He reached over and took the wine bottle by the neck and poured a little in my glass. "Whoever he is," I said, "he knows about the wolves." "He what?" "He knows about the wolves." I was very unsure of myself. It was like recounting a dream I had all but forgotten. "He knows I killed the wolves back home. He knows the cloak I wear is lined with their fur." "What are you talking about? You mean you've spoken to him?" "No, that's just it," I said. This was so confusing to me, so vague. I felt that swimming sensation again. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I've never spoken to him, never been near him. But he knows." "Ah, Lestat," he said. He sat back on the bench. He was smiling at me in the most endearing way. "Next you'll be seeing ghosts. You have the strongest imagination of anyone I've ever known." "There are no ghosts," I answered softly. I scowled at our little fire. I laid a few more lumps of coal on it. All the humor went out of Nicholas. How in the hell could he know about the wolves? "And how could you—" "I told you already. I don't know," I said. I sat thinking and not saying anything, disgusted maybe at how ridiculous it all seemed. And then, as we remained silent together and the fire was the only sound or movement in the room, the name Wolf Killer came to me very distinctly, as if someone had spoken it, but nobody had. I looked at Nick, painfully aware that his lips had never moved, and I think all the blood drained from my face. I felt not the dread of death as I had on so many other nights, but an emotion that was really alien to me. Fear. I was still sitting there, too unsure of myself to say anything, when Nicholas kissed me. "Let's go to bed," he said softly.